The wind across the Kansas prairie in the autumn of 1853 carried with it the smell of broken earth and distant rain. It was the kind of wind that spoke of endings rather than beginnings, though few who felt it could have said why. The territory itself was raw then, caught between what it had been and what men hoped to make it. A vast expanse of tall grass and rolling hills where the sky stretched so wide it seemed to press down upon the land with an almost physical weight. This was before the bleeding, before Kansas became synonymous with the violence that would tear the nation apart. But even then there was something in the air that tasted of copper and coming storms. In the third week of October that year, a wagon train of 11 families made camp along the banks of what they called Timber Creek, though it appeared on no map, and the timber itself was sparse, just a thin line of cottonwoods following the water's meandering course through the endless grass. They had come from Missouri mostly, seeking land that the government promised was theirs for the taking, fleeing the crowded settlements back east where every acre had a name and a price. Among them were the Weatherbys, Thomas and Sarah, and their 3 children, the youngest still nursing at her mother's breast. There were the Kellogg's, 6 strong sons and a father who spoke little but worked like 3 men. The Reverend Marcus Finch traveled with his wife Abigail, carrying a Bible bound in black leather and a conviction that this wilderness needed salvation as much as settlement. Others too, their names less important now than what they found, though their stories would be written in the earth and the ruins they left behind. Thomas Weatherby was 32 years old that October, a man of medium height, with hands calloused from years of farm work and eyes that had not yet learned to look too far into the distance. He had been a carpenter in Independence, Missouri, but the promise of 160 acres of Kansas prairie under the homestead provisions had seemed like deliverance from the small life he had been living. Sarah, his wife, was younger by 6 years, still possessed of the kind of beauty that hard living had not yet eroded entirely, though the journey west had put lines around her eyes that had not been there when they married. Their eldest child was a boy named Jacob, 10 years old and serious beyond his years, who had learned to drive the oxen and handle a rifle with competence, if not confidence. The middle child was a girl, Emma, 7 years old, with her mother's dark hair and a tendency towards silence that sometimes worried Sarah. And the baby was called Ruth, 6 months old and entirely unaware of the world she had been brought into, knowing only the warmth of her mother's arms and the motion of the wagon that had been her cradle since birth. The first time Thomas saw the house, he was riding ahead of the wagon train with Samuel Kellogg and the Reverend Finch, scouting for a suitable place to establish their claims. They had been traveling for nearly an hour from the creek when the land began to change, the endless grass giving way to a slight depression where the soil looked darker, richer, and small groves of trees appeared like islands in the sea of prairie. It was Samuel who pointed first, his arm extended toward something that seemed at first to be nothing more than a peculiar formation of rock, or perhaps a stand of dead timber. But as they rode closer, the shape resolved itself into something unmistakably human-made. A house stood alone in the hollow, perhaps 200 yards from a grove of blackjack oak that looked too deliberately placed to be natural. The structure itself was stone, built from the local limestone that could be found exposed in creek beds and ravines, with a roof that appeared to be slate or perhaps wooden shingles, weathered to the color of ash. It was not large, perhaps 20 feet by 30, with a single door facing east and 2 windows flanking it like eyes staring out across the grass. There was no smoke from any chimney, No sign of habitation, no cleared land around it or fence or outbuilding that might suggest a farm. Thomas felt something tighten in his chest as they approached, though he could not have named what it was. The house looked old, far older than it had any right to be in this territory that had been opened to settlement only in the past few years. The stone walls were weathered, dark with moisture and what might have been moss or lichen, and the wooden frames of the windows hung at angles that suggested the building had settled unevenly into the earth. Yet there was nothing overtly threatening about it, nothing that should have made Thomas want to turn his horse and ride back to the wagon train without investigating further. Samuel Kellogg, however, showed no such hesitation. He was off his horse and striding toward the door before Thomas could suggest caution, his heavy boots crushing the tall grass that grew right up to the foundation. The Reverend Finch dismounted as well, though more slowly, his weathered face showing an expression that might have been concern or merely thoughtfulness. Thomas followed, tying his horse to a scrubby bush that grew near what might once have been a path. The door was made of thick planks, weathered gray and held together with iron straps that showed rust like dried blood. There was no lock, no latch, only a simple wooden handle worn smooth by use. Samuel reached for it without ceremony and pushed. The door opened with a sound like a sigh, revealing darkness beyond that the afternoon sun did not seem able to penetrate. They stood at the threshold for a moment, three men in dusty traveling clothes, peering into the interior of a house that had no business existing where it stood. The smell that emerged was not unpleasant exactly, but strange, like old paper and dried herbs and something else underneath that might have been wood rot or animal musk. Thomas became aware of a sound, very faint, that might have been wind moving through the structure or might have been something else entirely, a kind of creaking or settling that old buildings make as they adjust to the weight of their own existence. Samuel stepped inside first. The Reverend Finch followed. Thomas, after a moment's hesitation that he would later wish had been stronger, crossed the threshold last. The interior was a single room, larger than it had appeared from outside, with a stone fireplace at the far end and rough wooden floors that were surprisingly solid under their boots. There was furniture, sparse but present, a table near the hearth, two chairs that looked handmade, a bed frame in one corner with a mattress that might have been stuffed with prairie grass. On the walls hung objects that suggested habitation, a cast iron pot, a few wooden utensils, a framed picture so faded that the image was no longer discernible. Everything was covered in a layer of dust that glittered in the light from the open door like ground glass. What struck Thomas most forcefully was the quality of the light itself. Though the sun outside had been bright, the illumination that entered through the door and the two windows seemed diminished somehow, as if the air inside the house absorbed it or transformed it into something weaker. Shadows gathered in the corners with an almost tangible density, and the far end of the room where the fireplace stood seemed impossibly distant, though Thomas knew it could not be more than 20 paces away. Samuel walked to the table and ran his finger through the dust, leaving a dark line in the gray powder. "Nobody's been here in years," he said, his voice loud in the stillness. "Decades, maybe. But the place is sound. Stone won't rot like wood. This could house a family through the winter easy." The Reverend Finch moved slowly around the perimeter of the room, his eyes taking in the details with the careful attention of a man accustomed to reading meaning in small things. He paused at the fireplace, bending down to examine the hearth. When he straightened, his face was troubled. "There's something not right here," he said quietly. "This house shouldn't be standing empty. Someone built it, put considerable work into it. Stone doesn't lay itself, but there's no claim marker, no indication of who owns it or why they left." Thomas felt the unease in his chest growing stronger. He turned to look back at the door, at the rectangle of daylight that seemed somehow farther away than it should be. And as he did so, he noticed something he had not seen when they entered. The frame of the door, the wooden jamb that surrounded it, was carved with marks, not random scratches, but deliberate symbols, repeating patterns that wound around the entire frame like a kind of text or warning. The marks were deep, cut into the wood with force, and filled with what looked like ash or some dark substance that made them stand out against the weathered gray. He was about to point this out to his companions when Samuel spoke again, his tone dismissive of the Reverend's concern. "Right or not, it's here and it's empty, and we need shelter for the winter. The families back at the creek won't survive in tents once the snow comes. This place could save lives." Reverend Finch did not respond immediately. He stood looking at the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, his tall frame slightly bent as if under the weight of thought. Finally, he said, "There are some things, Samuel, that are empty for a reason. Some places that are left alone because those who knew them understood they should be." But Samuel was already moving back toward the door, his mind made up, his practical nature overriding whatever superstitious caution the Reverend was suggesting. "We'll bring the wagons here tomorrow. The Weatherbys can take this house, and we'll build others nearby. This hollow has good soil and shelter from the wind. It's the best site we've found." Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to give voice to the wrongness he felt in this place, but the words would not come. He was not a man given to intuition or spiritual concerns. He trusted in what he could see and touch, in the work of his hands and the evidence of his eyes. And what he saw was a solid structure that could house his family through the brutal Kansas winter that was coming. What he felt was merely the strangeness of finding such a thing in the middle of empty prairie, nothing more. They left the house as the sun was lowering toward the horizon, mounting their horses and riding back toward the creek where the wagons waited. Behind them, the door of the stone house stood open, a dark mouth in the face of the structure, and if any of them had looked back, they might have seen that the shadows inside seemed to have grown deeper, more substantial, as if the house itself was drawing breath. That night, gathered around the campfire with the other families, Samuel Kellogg spoke enthusiastically about their discovery. He described the stone construction, the solid floor, the size of the single room. Thomas added what details he could, trying to match Samuel's optimism, but finding that the words felt heavy in his mouth. The Reverend Finch said nothing at all, sitting slightly apart from the others, staring into the flames with an expression that might have been prayer or merely deep thought. Sarah Weatherby listened to her husband's description with the careful attention of a woman who had learned to hear what was not said as clearly as what was. When the others had drifted to their own wagons and bedrolls, she took Thomas aside, the baby Ruth sleeping against her shoulder, and asked him directly what troubled him about the place. Thomas looked at his wife's face in the firelight, at the concern there and the tiredness, and he felt the weight of responsibility that came with being the man who made decisions for his family. "It's nothing," he said, the lie sitting uneasily on his tongue. "Just an old house that someone abandoned. Samuel's right that it could shelter us through the winter. It would be foolish to pass it up." Sarah studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes reflecting the flames, and then she nodded slowly. She did not believe him entirely, he could see that, but she trusted him enough to accept his judgment. They had come too far and risked too much to turn back now over a feeling of unease that Thomas himself could not adequately explain. The next morning, the wagon train broke camp before dawn, the 11 families packing their possessions and yoking their oxen with the practiced efficiency of people who had been traveling for months. They followed Thomas and Samuel and the Reverend toward the hollow where the stone house waited, the wagons creaking and groaning over the uneven ground, children running alongside and calling to each other with the boundless energy of youth that even hardship could not entirely diminish. They reached the house as the sun cleared the horizon, turning the prairie grass to gold and casting long shadows from the wagons and animals. The structure looked different in the morning light, less ominous perhaps, though no less strange in its solitary existence. The families gathered around it in a loose circle, staring at the stone walls and slate roof with expressions ranging from hope to skepticism. It was agreed that Thomas and Sarah and their children would take the house, as they had been first to see it, and the other families would establish their claims on the surrounding land, building temporary shelters until more permanent structures could be raised. The men began unloading the wagons while the women organized supplies and the children explored the area with the fearlessness of those too young to have learned proper caution. Thomas stood before the door of the house, the same door he had entered the previous day, and felt again that tightness in his chest, that sense of wrongness that seemed to emanate from the building itself. He pushed the feeling down, buried it under the practical concerns of providing shelter for his family, and reached for the handle. The door opened as it had before, with that sighing sound, revealing the interior that seemed somehow darker than it should be given the brightness of the morning outside. Sarah stood beside him, Ruth in her arms, Emma clinging to her skirt, and Jacob behind them, carrying a bundle of blankets. They crossed the threshold together, the Weatherby family entering their new home. What Thomas noticed first was that the dust was gone. The thick layer of gray powder that had covered everything the day before, the dust that Samuel had drawn his finger through to leave that dark line, had vanished entirely. The floor was clean. The table was clean. The few furnishings showed no sign of the decades of abandonment that the dust had suggested. The cast iron pot hanging on the wall gleamed dully in the weak light, as if it had been recently oiled. The wooden utensils looked almost new. Sarah noticed it too. She stopped just inside the door, her eyes moving slowly around the room, and Thomas saw her arms tighten around the baby. "Thomas," she said quietly, the single word carrying a question and a concern that he felt echo in his own chest. But before he could respond, before he could acknowledge the impossibility of what they were seeing, Jacob spoke from behind them, his young voice filled with confusion. "Pa, the door—" Thomas turned. The door through which they had just entered, the door that had stood open behind them, letting in the morning light, was different. The wood was darker, the iron straps more corroded, the surface weathered to a degree that it had not been moments before. As he stared, trying to make sense of what his eyes were showing him, he saw that the frame, too, had changed. The carved symbols he had noticed the previous day were still there. They seemed deeper now, more pronounced, and there were cracks in the wood that radiated out from them like roots seeking soil. Outside, visible through the doorway and the windows, the prairie looked different as well. The grass seemed taller, though that was impossible, and the grove of blackjack oak to the north appeared fuller, the trees larger than they had been. The quality of the light had changed, the golden brightness of morning replaced by something grayer, more diffuse, as if clouds had moved in to cover the sun, though Thomas had seen no clouds in the clear October sky. Sarah moved to the nearest window, still holding Ruth, and looked out, her breath caught audibly. "Thomas, the wagons! Where are the wagons?" Thomas crossed the room in 3 strides and looked out the window beside her. The circle of wagons that had been visible from the house, the 11 families unpacking and setting up camp, was gone. In its place was emptiness, just the tall grass moving in wind that Thomas could not hear from inside the stone walls. No wagons, no oxen, no people. The prairie stretched away unchanged, except for the subtle differences in the vegetation, as if they were looking at a landscape that was familiar but wrong in ways too numerous and too small to catalog. Jacob and Emma crowded close, the children's eyes wide with fear they did not yet understand. Thomas felt a coldness spreading through his body that had nothing to do with temperature. He turned and strode to the door, grabbing the weathered wooden handle and pulling hard. The door opened, and the sound it made was no longer a sigh, but a groan. Wood and iron complaining against age and rust. He stepped out onto the prairie, his family behind him, and the impossibility of what he was seeing hit him with full force. The hollow where the house stood looked the same, and yet utterly different. The grass was taller, yes, but more than that, it was different grass, species he did not recognize growing among the familiar varieties. The grove of oak trees was larger, mature in a way that would have taken decades, and there were other trees among them now, species he was certain had not been there that morning. The soil itself looked different, darker and more broken, as if it had been plowed and left to grow wild again. Behind him, he heard Sarah's voice, tight with panic she was trying to control for the sake of the children. "Thomas, what's happening? Where is everyone?" He had no answer. He stood on the prairie in the bright daylight of what should have been mid-morning in October of 1853 and looked at a landscape that seemed to belong to a different time entirely. The sun was still in the sky, but higher now, as if hours had passed in the moments they had been inside. The quality of the air itself was different, drier somehow, with a smell that was not the smell of the prairie he had come to know during months of travel. A sound drew his attention to the south, a distant rumbling that grew steadily louder. For a moment, he thought it might be thunder, but the sky was clear, that strange gray blue that seemed wrong in ways he could not articulate. Then he saw it, a line of dust rising in the distance, and beneath it, moving with mechanical precision, something that his mind struggled to categorize. It was a machine made of iron and steel, running on rails that Thomas was certain had not been there before, pulling cars behind it in a long chain. The sound it made was like nothing he had ever heard, a rhythmic clanking and hissing that spoke of steam and industry. A train. He was looking at a train, though the rails had not been laid and the railway companies had not yet pushed this far into Kansas territory. Yet there it was, solid and real, cutting across the prairie in the distance, trailing smoke that rose into the strange sky. Sarah had seen it too. She stood beside him, Ruth beginning to cry against her shoulder, and her voice when she spoke was barely above a whisper. "How long were we inside? How long?" Thomas turned to look back at the house. It stood exactly as it had. Solid stone walls and slate roof, the door open behind them like a mouth. But even as he watched, he could see the changes. The mortar between the stones looked more crumbled, the slate tiles more weathered, the entire structure settling more deeply into the earth. And around the foundation, Growing in thick profusion, where there had been only grass that morning, were plants he did not recognize, weeds and vines that wrapped around the base of the walls as if the house had been standing there, alone and abandoned, for far longer than the few hours since they had arrived. Young Jacob spoke, his voice cracking slightly. "Pa, I want to go back. I want to find the others." "Where did they go?" Emma was crying now. Not the baby's wail of discomfort, but the frightened sobbing of a child old enough to understand that something was terribly wrong. Thomas felt the weight of their fear, felt the responsibility of being father and protector, and felt utterly helpless in the face of something he could not begin to comprehend. "We'll go back inside," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We'll get our things and leave this place, find the others. There has to be an explanation." But even as he said it, he knew it was wrong. The evidence of his eyes told him that time had passed, considerable time, while they had been inside the house. The landscape had aged, the vegetation had grown, railways had been built where none had existed, yet they themselves had not aged, had felt no passage of time beyond the few moments it had taken to cross the threshold and look around the interior. Sarah gripped his arm, her fingers tight enough to hurt. "Don't go back in there, Thomas. Whatever this place is, we need to stay out of it. We'll walk back to the creek, find the wagons. They can't be far." But they were far. Thomas knew it with a certainty that made his stomach turn. The wagons were not just far in distance, but far in time, separated from them by something that the house had done or was or represented. The train in the distance was proof enough. Kansas, in 1853, had no trains running through open prairie. Whatever year it was now, it was not the year they had left. He looked at his wife, at his children, at their faces marked with fear and confusion, and he made a decision that felt like surrender. "We'll leave," he said. "Now, we'll walk south, away from this place, and we'll find help, someone who can explain what's happened." They started walking, leaving the house with its open door behind them, heading south because the train had gone that direction, and where there were trains, there would be people, civilization, help. Ruth's crying subsided to whimpering as the motion soothed her, and Emma held her brother's hand with a grip that spoke of desperation. Sarah walked close beside Thomas, and he could feel the trembling in her body, though she said nothing. Behind them, unseen, the door of the stone house swung slowly closed, and the sound it made was neither sigh nor groan, but something closer to satisfaction. They walked for what felt like hours, though the sun seemed to move strangely in the sky, sometimes advancing and sometimes holding still, as if time itself was uncertain. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, and though the grass and vegetation were wrong, the fundamental character of the landscape was the same. Rolling hills and distant horizons, the vast bowl of sky pressing down. Jacob asked questions at first, trying to understand, but when Thomas had no answers, the boy fell silent, concentrating on putting one foot in front of the other. Emma stumbled frequently, her shorter legs struggling to keep pace, and Thomas ended up carrying her, his daughter's arms wrapped around his neck and her face buried against his shoulder. When they finally saw the town, the sun was low in the west, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed too vivid, almost artificial. It appeared on the horizon as a dark line that resolved itself into buildings as they drew closer. Wooden structures mostly, a main street, the characteristic shape of a frontier settlement, but larger and more established than any town Thomas had seen in Kansas territory. There were telegraph lines He could see them stretching between poles like the threads of some enormous spider's web, and more of the iron rails running alongside what looked like a proper road. As they entered the outskirts, people stared at them with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Thomas became aware of how they must look. A man, a woman, 2 children, and a baby, wearing clothes that were dusty and worn from months of travel, walking out of the empty prairie with no wagon, no horses, no supplies. Sarah's dress was the style that had been common in Missouri when they left. But looking at the women on the street, Thomas could see that fashions had changed. The cuts were different. The fabrics, the way the skirts hung, and the bodices were fitted. A man stepped forward from the porch of what appeared to be a general store, middle-aged with a gray beard and eyes that were not unkind. "You folks need help? You look lost." Thomas swallowed, his throat dry from the long walk. We need to know what town this is, what year." The man's expression shifted to concern. "This is Timber Creek. Been called that for 40 years or more. As for the year, friend, it's 1896. Where have you been that you don't know what year it is?" 1896? The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. 43 years had passed. 43 years since that October morning in 1853, when they had driven their wagons toward the stone house in the hollow. 43 years gone in the space of minutes, lost to whatever curse or power resided in that place. Sarah made a sound, a stifled sob or gasp, and the baby in her arms began crying again. Sensing her mother's distress, Jacob looked up at Thomas with eyes that held too much understanding for a child of 10, and Emma buried her face more deeply against her father's chest. The gathered townspeople were murmuring now, their voices low and concerned, and the bearded man was asking more questions. Thomas could not focus on the words. His mind was reeling, trying to process the impossibility of what had happened, trying to find some rational explanation in a situation that defied all reason. A woman pushed through the small crowd that had gathered, older than Sarah but with a kind face, wearing the improved dress style that marked her as a woman of some means. "Henry, stop pestering them with questions. Can't you see they're in distress? Come, dear," she said to Sarah. "You and your children need food and rest. We'll sort out the details later." They were led to a large house on the edge of town, the home of Henry and Martha Blackwood, who Thomas would learn were among the town's founding families. Martha installed Sarah and the children in a guest room, bringing water for washing and bread and milk for eating, while Henry sat with Thomas in the parlor, a room that seemed impossibly luxurious with its upholstered furniture and kerosene lamps and pictures on the walls. Thomas told him everything. It poured out of him in a rush of words that he could not contain. The wagon train, the discovery of the house, the moment they had crossed the threshold and found the world changed. Henry listened without interruption, his face growing more grave as the story progressed, and when Thomas finished, the older man sat silent for a long moment before speaking. "I know the place you're talking about," Henry said finally. "The stone house in the hollow, about 3 miles northwest of here. It's been there for as long as anyone can remember. Longer than this town, longer than white settlement in these parts. The Indians won't go near it. They call it the House of Stolen Time. Say it was built by something that came before, something that feeds on the years of men." Thomas felt his hands begin to shake. "Then you believe me? You don't think I'm mad?" Henry's eyes were sad. "Oh, I believe you. There have been others over the years, though not many, and most don't come back to tell the tale. There was a surveyor back in '68 who went inside to take measurements and came out to find 30 years had passed. He died of a broken heart. they say. All the people he'd known long gone or old, beyond recognition. There was a family in 74, homesteaders like yourselves. They went in and came out to find 10 years gone. Their land claim had been forfeit. Their relatives back east thought them dead. They tried to rebuild, but, well, some losses are too great to recover from. The room seemed to tilt around Thomas. He gripped the arms of the chair, fighting the wave of dizziness that threatened to overwhelm him. What is it? What causes it? Henry shook his head slowly. No one knows for certain. The old Kansa and Osage tribes have stories about the land here, about places where the veil between times is thin, where the past and the future touch. They say the house was built on such a place, maybe by someone who understood the power there, or maybe the house itself called the power to it. All I know for certain is that it's dangerous, has been for as long as anyone can remember, and folks who know better stay away from it. But someone should tear it down, Thomas said desperately. Destroy it so it can't hurt anyone else. Been tried, Henry replied. More than once. Men go in with axes and hammers and come out to find decades gone by. Their strength spent, their tools rusted to pieces. The house ages, yes, but it doesn't fall. It stands there waiting, and every year it seems a little older, but never less solid. Some say it's aging backward somehow, getting closer to whatever ancient beginning gave it power. Others say it's stealing the years from anyone foolish enough to enter, using that stolen time to sustain itself. I don't claim to know which is true. Thomas sat in the comfortable chair in the house of strangers in a town that had not existed when he woke that morning, in a year that should have been distant future, and felt the full weight of what had been taken from him settle onto his shoulders. His parents would be dead, almost certainly. The friends he had left behind in Missouri would be old men and women, if they lived at all. The world he had known was gone, replaced by this strange new place with its trains and telegraph lines and fashions he did not recognize. And yet, he and his family had not aged. Sarah was still 26 as she had been that morning. Jacob was still 10. Emma still 7. Ruth still 6 months. They were anachronisms, ghosts out of time, walking around in a world that had moved on without them. That night, lying in the guest bed beside his wife while the children slept on pallets on the floor, Thomas whispered the question that terrified him most. What do we do now? How do we live in a world where we don't belong? Sarah was quiet for a long time, her hand finding his in the darkness. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, stronger than he had expected. We survive. We adapt. We make a life here, in this time, because we have no choice. The children need us to be strong, Thomas. Whatever that house took from us, it didn't take our family. We still have each other. He wanted to believe her, wanted to find comfort in the truth of those words, but the darkness seemed full of ghosts. The ghost of Samuel Kellogg, who would now be an old man if he still lived, the ghost of Reverend Finch and his wife Abigail, the ghosts of all the families who had traveled west with them and were now separated by an unbridgeable gulf of years. And lurking behind all the other ghosts was the memory of the house itself, standing in its hollow doors open like a mouth, waiting for the next fool who would cross its threshold. The days that followed were a blur of adjustment and learning. Henry and Martha Blackwood were generous beyond measure, providing food and shelter, while Thomas and Sarah tried to understand the world they had been thrust into. There were so many changes, small and large. The country was different. States and territories that had not existed in 1853 were now part of the Union. The war everyone had feared back then The war over slavery and states' rights had happened and ended 3 decades ago, leaving scars that were still visible in the way people spoke of the South and the North as if they were still separate countries. The technology was bewildering. The trains that had seemed so impossible were commonplace now, crisscrossing the nation on thousands of miles of track. There were machines for farming that made the work of 10 men obsolete, factories that could produce goods in hours that would have taken weeks by hand. The telegraph Henry had mentioned could send messages across the country almost instantly, a kind of magic that Thomas struggled to accept as merely science. But more than the technology, more than the political changes, what struck Thomas most forcefully was the sense of time's passage that was visible everywhere. The frontier that had been raw and new in 1853 was settled now, tamed, divided into farms and ranches and towns. The Indians, who had still held much of the territory when Thomas left Missouri, were confined to reservations now, their way of life destroyed or diminished almost beyond recognition. The endless prairie grass had been plowed under, replaced by wheat and corn in orderly fields. The wild abundance had given way to cultivation and control. Timber Creek itself had grown from a tiny settlement to a proper town, with a population of nearly 2,000, a school, 2 churches, a bank, a newspaper office. The main street was lined with businesses, dry goods stores, a livery, a hotel, a pharmacy, even a photographer's studio with a sign advertising portraits in the new style. People dressed differently, spoke differently, moved with the confidence of those who had conquered the land rather than the desperate hope of those seeking to claim it. Thomas found work with a carpenter named Jensen, a German immigrant who spoke English with a heavy accent, but whose skill with wood was undeniable. The tools had changed in 43 years. There were new techniques and materials, but the fundamental craft was the same, and Thomas's hands remembered even if his mind struggled to keep up. Sarah took in sewing, her skill with a needle finding ready customers among the town's women, and slowly, painfully, they began to build a new life. Jacob and Emma were enrolled in the school, where the other children regarded them with curiosity and occasional cruelty. It was hard for the Weatherby children to explain where they had come from, why they seemed so strange and out of place, why they did not know things that every other child their age took for granted. The teacher, Miss Thornton, was patient with them, but Thomas could see in her eyes that she thought his children were slow, perhaps simple-minded, when in truth they were simply from a different time. Ruth, being still a baby, adapted most easily. She would grow up in this new world with no memory of the old, would be a woman of 1896 in a way her siblings could never be. Sarah clung to this thought like a lifeline, finding hope in her youngest daughter's easy adjustment when everything else seemed so impossibly difficult. But Thomas could not let go. The house haunted him, both the physical structure standing in its hollow 3 miles northwest and the metaphysical weight of what it represented. He found himself drawn to the newspaper office, reading through back issues, searching for any mention of the stone house or others who had suffered its curse. He found a few references, brief notices that took on a sinister cast in light of what he now knew. A homesteader who had disappeared in 1862 and reappeared 30 years later, claiming no time had passed. A group of surveyors in 1870 whose entire camp had vanished and been found days later, aged beyond recognition. The newspaper treated these as curiosities, strange stories to be wondered at, but not too seriously investigated. In the town's small library, housed in a room above the general store, Thomas found something else. A journal kept by one of Timber Creek's founders, a man named Josiah Warren, who had been among the first whites to settle in the area. The journal was written in a crabbed hand that was difficult to read, but Thomas persevered, driven by a need to understand. Josiah Warren had encountered the house in the spring of 1854, just months after Thomas had first seen it. Warren described finding the structure already ancient-looking, stones weathered and mortar crumbling, though he knew for a fact that the land had been unsettled just years before. He had been warned away by an old Kansa man who spoke enough English to make himself understood. The warning had been vague but emphatic. The house was not for men, was a place where time ran wrong, where the world was thin and dangerous things could pass through. Warren had heeded the warning, but he had also recorded what the Kansa man told him about the house's origins. According to tribal memory, the structure had always been there, present when the Kansa first came to the region generations before, already ancient and already cursed. There were stories of others who had built it or found it, beings from before the tribes, creatures that moved through time as easily as men move through space. But these stories were fragmentary, confused, the kind of myths that accumulate around things too strange to be easily understood. What was clear, what was consistent in all the stories, was the danger. The house aged those who entered it, or it aged itself, or it did something to time that human language struggled to articulate. Each entry cost years, sometimes many, sometimes few, but always years that could never be recovered. And the house itself seemed to grow stronger from these stolen moments, seemed to draw power from the temporal distortion it created. Thomas copied passages from the journal into a small notebook he had purchased, writing by lamplight in the room the Blackwoods had given them while Sarah and the children slept. He was looking for a pattern, for some understanding that might allow him to make sense of what had happened to his family, but the more he read, the more he felt he was approaching something fundamentally incomprehensible, a phenomenon that existed outside the normal rules of causation and effect. One night, nearly a month after they had arrived in Timber Creek, Thomas dreamed of the house. In the dream, he was standing before the door, his hand on the weathered wooden handle, and he could hear something on the other side. Not a sound exactly, but a kind of temporal noise, the sound that time itself might make if it could speak. The door was covered in the carved symbols he had noticed that first day, but in the dream he could read them, could understand the warning they represented. Each threshold crossing demanded payment. Each entry required years, and the house would take what it needed regardless of whether the person crossing understood the cost. He woke with his heart pounding, Sarah stirring beside him in concern. "What is it?" she whispered, her hand on his chest. "I can't let this stand," he said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. "Other people will come, other families. The house will take more years, more lives. Someone has to stop it." Sarah was quiet, her hand still on his chest, feeling the rapid beating of his heart. "How do you stop something like that? Henry said it's been tried." "I don't know, but I have to try. I have to do something." In the morning, he went to Henry Blackwood and asked to borrow a horse. Henry, who had come to understand Thomas better over the past month, did not ask where he was going. He simply handed over the reins to a sturdy mare and said, "Be careful, Thomas. Don't let vengeance or anger make you do something foolish." Thomas rode northwest, following directions that were both remembered and intuited, until he came to the hollow where the stone house stood. It looked different than he remembered, though whether that was because it had aged further or because his memory was playing tricks, He could not say. The stone walls were darker, more weathered, and the vegetation around the foundation had grown thicker. Wild roses and brambles that twisted around the base like grasping fingers. He dismounted, but did not approach the door. Instead, he walked slowly around the perimeter of the structure, studying it with the eye of a carpenter, looking for weaknesses in the construction. What he saw troubled him. The house was old, clearly, but it was also solid in a way that defied its apparent age. The stones were fitted together with extraordinary precision, and where the mortar had crumbled, the stones themselves held each other up through sheer weight and balance. It was masterwork, the kind of construction that was built to last centuries or longer. On the western side, partially obscured by the wild growth, he found something he had not seen before. Markings on the stones themselves, not the symbols carved into the door frame, but something else, petroglyphs perhaps, or some kind of ancient writing. They were weathered almost to invisibility, but in the right light they stood out faintly, patterns that might have been representations of the sun and moon and stars, or might have been something else entirely. Diagrams of time itself, perhaps. Maps of the impossible geography that the house somehow traversed. He was so focused on the markings that he did not hear the approach of the other man until a voice spoke behind him. Thinking about going inside? I wouldn't recommend it. Thomas spun around to find a young man standing at the edge of the hollow, perhaps 25 years old, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that held a wary caution. He was dressed in the modern style, trousers and vest and white shirt, with a leather satchel slung over one shoulder. "Who are you?" Thomas asked, his hand instinctively moving toward the knife he wore at his belt. The young man raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Name's Daniel Cartwright. I'm a surveyor from Topeka. I've been studying this place for the past 6 months, trying to understand it. I heard there was a family that went through the house recently, ended up 43 years in the future. Would that be you?" Thomas nodded slowly, studying the other man. "What do you mean, studying it?" Cartwright gestured toward his satchel. "I've got instruments, measurements, observations. I'm trying to document what this place is, how it works. The university back east is interested in temporal anomalies, places where time doesn't behave the way it's supposed to. This house is one of the most stable and accessible examples I've been able to find." "Stable?" Thomas felt anger rising in his throat. "It stole 43 years from me and my family. There's nothing stable about it." "I don't mean stable in the moral sense," Cartwright said quickly. "I mean it's consistent. The temporal distortion is always present, always active. Other anomalous sites are intermittent, unpredictable, but this house, it's always here, always doing what it does. That makes it valuable for study." Thomas took a step toward the surveyor, his fists clenching. "Study? You want to study it? It should be destroyed, burned to the ground so it can't hurt anyone else." Cartwright did not back away, but his expression became more serious. "I understand your anger, Mr. Weatherby. I do. But destroying it might be impossible, and if it is possible, it might be dangerous in ways we can't predict. What if the house is containing something? What if it's not causing the temporal distortion, but simply marking the location where one exists? Destroy the house, and you might just expose the underlying anomaly, make it more dangerous rather than less." Thomas had not considered this possibility, and the thought stopped him cold. "What do you mean, underlying anomaly?" The surveyor pulled a folded paper from his satchel and spread it on the ground, weighing down the corners with small stones. It was a map of the area around Timber Creek, rendered in careful detail, but with something else overlaid on it. Lines of different colors, circles and spirals that converged on the location where the house stood. "I've been taking measurements," Cartwright explained. "Temporal gradient, gravitational variation, magnetic field strength. This area shows anomalies in all three. The house sits at the convergence point, the place where the distortion is strongest. I think the house was built to mark the location, maybe even to control or contain the effect. The symbols you've probably noticed, the ones carved into the doorframe and stones, they're not random. They follow patterns that are consistent with containment geometries in other cultures, other times." Thomas stared at the map, trying to make sense of the lines and symbols. "You're saying someone built the house deliberately to contain this temporal, whatever it is?" "That's my theory. And if I'm right, if the house is serving a containment function, then destroying it could release whatever it's containing. The distortion could spread, affect a larger area. You'd be trading a localized danger for a potentially regional or worse catastrophe." The anger that had driven Thomas to ride out here was still present, but it was now mixed with something colder, more insidious, fear. Fear that the surveyor was right, that the house could not be destroyed without making things worse, that he and his family were victims of something too vast and too ancient to be addressed through any action he could take. "Then what do we do?" he asked, his voice hollow. "Just let it stand? Let it keep taking people?" Cartwright folded his map carefully before responding. "We warn people. We document it so that future generations might understand it better. We mark it as dangerous and hope that knowledge keeps people away. It's not satisfying, I know, but sometimes that's all we can do in the face of forces we don't fully comprehend." Thomas looked back at the house, at its dark stones and weathered door, and he felt a profound despair settle over him. This was not an enemy he could fight, not a challenge he could overcome through work or will or courage. It simply was, had been, would continue to be, indifferent to his loss and his anger and his need for justice or recompense. He mounted his horse and rode back to Timber Creek without another word to the surveyor, leaving Daniel Cartwright alone with his instruments and his theories and his careful measurements of the impossible. The years passed, as years do, with a regularity that Thomas found both comforting and deeply ironic, given what had happened to him. His children grew, Jacob into a serious young man who learned carpentry from his father and showed a gift for the trade. Emma into a quiet girl who loved books and spent her free time in the library above the general store. Ruth into a bright and energetic child who knew no other world than this one and seemed utterly at home in 1896 and beyond. Sarah adapted better than Thomas had feared, finding a community among the women of Timber Creek, making friends who knew their story but chose not to dwell on its strangeness. But Thomas could never fully let go. The house haunted his dreams, and sometimes on the clearest days, he could look northwest and imagine he could see the hollow where it stood, could feel its presence like a weight on the horizon. He heard stories occasionally of others who had encountered it. A young couple in 1900 who had entered and emerged to find 15 years gone. A surveying team in 1904 who had lost 22 years in a moment. Each story was a wound reopened, a reminder of his own loss and his powerlessness to prevent others from suffering the same fate. In 1907, when Thomas was technically 86 years old, though his body was only 46, the Timber Creek newspaper ran a longer story about the house. It was written by a journalist from Kansas City who had come specifically to investigate the legends, and it laid out the history of the place as completely as anyone had. The disappearances, the temporal distortions, the theories about what might cause such a phenomenon. The article concluded with a warning that seemed both too little and too late. Those venturing into the Kansas prairie would do well to avoid the stone structure known locally as the House of Stolen Time. Whatever mystery resides there is not worth the cost it demands. Thomas cut the article out and kept it in his notebook, along with the passages he had copied from Josiah Warren's journal years before. He had become something of a local authority on the house, though he hated the role, and people would occasionally come to him with questions or theories or their own plans to investigate. He warned them all off, told them his story with a grave emphasis that usually succeeded in dampening their curiosity. But not always. In 1912, a group of young men from Topeka arrived in Timber Creek, students from the State University who had heard about the house and wanted to study it, as Daniel Cartwright had decades before. Thomas met with them, tried to dissuade them, showed them his notebook with its careful documentation of the house's history. They listened politely, but Thomas could see in their eyes that they did not truly believe, did not truly understand. They were young and confident and certain that scientific knowledge could protect them from what was ultimately beyond science's ability to address. They went to the house despite his warnings. 4 of them entered together, planning to take measurements and observations from inside. According to the 5th man who waited outside, they were inside for no more than 5 minutes. When they emerged, they were old men, aged 50 years in those few minutes, their young bodies transformed into failing flesh, their hair white, their faces lined with the weight of decades lived in accelerated time. One died within hours, his heart unable to sustain the shock. The others survived, but were forever changed, living out what remained of their shortened lives as cautionary tales. The incident made national news. Reporters came from as far as New York and California, eager to document the phenomenon, to photograph the house and interview the survivors and write breathless accounts of the impossible. Thomas refused to speak to any of them, sickened by the spectacle, by the way his family's tragedy and the tragedy of others was being turned into entertainment. Sarah found him one evening sitting alone in the workshop he had built behind their house, his head in his hands, and she sat beside him in silence for a long time before speaking. "You can't save everyone, Thomas. You can't prevent every foolish decision. At some point, you have to let go of this anger." "I don't want to let go," he said quietly. "If I let go, if I accept it, then those years we lost don't matter. Our entire future, the life we were supposed to have, it just disappears into nothing." "Our future didn't disappear," Sarah said firmly. "It changed. We're here now in this time. Our children have grown, have lives of their own. Jacob's engaged to that nice girl from the church. Emma's going to be a teacher. Ruth's at the top of her class. We've built something, Thomas, in spite of everything. Don't let the house take any more from us than it already has." He looked at his wife, the gray in her hair that had come from years of living rather than from the house's curse, at the lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and worry in equal measure, and he felt something inside him crack. She was right. The house had taken 43 years, had displaced them in time and stolen the future they had planned. But it had not destroyed them. They had survived, had adapted, had made a life in this strange new world. To let the house dominate his thoughts, to let anger and loss consume him, was to give it a victory it had not yet earned. "I love you," he said, the words inadequate, but true. Sarah took his hand, her grip strong and warm. "I know, and I love you. And we're going to be all right, Thomas. We already are. But even as he tried to accept her words, tried to let go of his obsession with the house, Thomas could not entirely shake the feeling that something was unfinished. The house stood, would continue to stand, would continue to take years from the unwary and the curious. Daniel Cartwright's theories suggested it was serving some kind of containment function, but Thomas was not convinced. A container implies an intent to protect, to keep something locked away for the safety of others. The house felt more like a predator, patient and eternal, feeding on time itself. In the spring of 1918, as the world was caught up in the terrible war that had consumed Europe and now reached across the ocean to touch America, Thomas received a letter from Daniel Cartwright. The surveyor was older now, his work at the university having established him as something of an expert in what he called temporal phenomena, and his letter was long and detailed and filled with the kind of technical language that Thomas had to read multiple times to understand. The essential message, however, was clear. Cartwright had refined his theories about the house. He now believed that it was not containing a temporal anomaly, but was itself a kind of mechanism, a device built by someone or something that understood time in ways that humans did not. The purpose of the mechanism was unclear, but Cartwright suspected it was gathering or storing temporal energy, accumulating the years it stole for some purpose that might only become apparent far in the future. The letter concluded with a warning. My calculations suggest that the house's accumulation of stolen time may be approaching some kind of critical threshold. What happens when that threshold is reached, I cannot say, but I believe we may see the answer within our lifetimes. I have petitioned the state government to establish an exclusion zone around the structure, but my requests have been denied. All I can do is continue to monitor and hope that when the event occurs, if it occurs, we are prepared. Thomas showed the letter to Sarah, who read it with an expression of growing concern. What does he think will happen? He doesn't know, but whatever it is, he thinks it will be significant. They discussed whether to leave Timber Creek, to move away from the house, and whatever danger it might represent. But in the end, they stayed. This was their home now, the place where they had built their life, where their children had grown up. Jacob had married and had 2 children of his own, grandchildren that Thomas and Sarah doted on. Emma was teaching at the school, shaping young minds with patience and care. Ruth was engaged to the son of the town's doctor, planning a wedding for the summer. To leave now would be to abandon all of that, and neither Thomas nor Sarah could bring themselves to do it. Years passed. The war ended. The 20s arrived with their jazz and prosperity, and Timber Creek grew into a small city connected to the wider world by telephone and radio and improved roads. The house remained, as it had always been, a dark presence on the edge of awareness. But as the older generation died and was replaced by those who had not experienced its curse directly, it became more legend than threat, a curiosity rather than a danger. Thomas himself was an old man now, truly old, his body catching up to the years that the calendar said he should have lived. He was in his 70s as the calendar measured it, though his body was only in its 50s, a strange disjunction that sometimes confused him when he looked in the mirror. His hands still worked well enough to do carpentry, though they trembled with a palsy that embarrassed him, and his mind remained sharp despite the gray fog that sometimes descended over his memories. On a cold morning in January of 1928, Thomas woke before dawn with the certainty that something had changed. He could not have said what or how he knew, but the feeling was undeniable, as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis during the night. Sarah was still asleep beside him, her breathing steady and peaceful, and Thomas lay still for a long moment before rising and dressing quietly. He walked to the window and looked out at the town, at the houses and buildings visible in the gray pre-dawn light, and everything appeared normal. Yet the feeling persisted, a sense of anticipation or dread or both, pulling at him like a tide. Without quite deciding to do so, he found himself pulling on his coat and boots, found himself leaving the house and walking through the quiet streets toward the edge of town and beyond, toward the northwest where the house stood in its hollow. The prairie was different than it had been in his youth, more settled and cultivated, the endless grass broken up by fields and fences, but in the dim light it was possible to imagine it as it had been, vast and wild and full of possibility. Thomas walked for nearly an hour, his breath steaming in the cold air, following a path he had not taken in years, but that his body seemed to remember. When he reached the hollow, he stopped at the edge and stared down at the stone house. It looked the same as it always had, solid and ancient and wrong, but there was something else now, something he could not quite define. The air around it seemed to shimmer slightly, as if heat were rising from the ground, though it was January and everything was frozen. The quality of light was strange, not quite matching the gray dawn that surrounded it, as if the house existed in a slightly different time or place than the rest of the world. As Thomas watched, the door of the house opened, not slowly, not with the careful creak of old hinges, but suddenly, as if pushed from inside by a strong wind. The opening revealed not the interior that Thomas remembered, but something else, a darkness that seemed to have depth and dimension, a space that was larger and stranger than the modest room that should have been there. And then, emerging from that darkness, came figures, people, or things that looked like people, dressed in clothes that ranged across decades or centuries, some familiar and some utterly foreign. They walked out of the house and stood in the hollow, and as each one emerged, they seemed to solidify, to become more real, as if the house had been holding them in some kind of suspension and was now releasing them. Thomas counted 20, then 30, then lost track as more and more emerged. Some looked around with confusion, others with wonder or terror, and a few with the blank acceptance of those who have been lost for so long that finding themselves anywhere at all seems like a gift rather than a curse. They were of all ages, all types, and as Thomas watched, he saw among them people he recognized. Samuel Kellogg, older but unmistakably the same strong-featured man who had entered the house with Thomas 75 years ago. Reverend Finch and his wife Abigail, looking aged but alive, their faces showing the strain of whatever they had experienced. Others from the wagon train, people Thomas had thought lost forever. And still they came, emerging from the house in a steady stream, until nearly 100 people stood in the hollow, blinking in the dawn light, like sleepers awakened from a long dream. The house itself was changing as they emerged, its stones crumbling visibly, mortar falling away in chunks, the roof sagging under its own weight. It was as if the release of the people was costing the structure its integrity, as if whatever had sustained it was now being spent. Thomas found himself running down into the hollow, his old man's body protesting, but his need to understand overcoming his caution. He reached the edge of the group and stopped, staring at faces that were familiar and strange in equal measure. Samuel Kellogg saw him, and recognition flared in the older man's eyes. Thomas Weatherby? My God, you're old. How long has it been? 75 years, Thomas said, his voice hoarse. 75 years since we found this place. What happened to you? Where have you been? Samuel looked around at the other people emerging from the house, at the crumbling structure behind them, and his face showed a confusion that Thomas recognized all too well. We went in after you. When you didn't come back out, we thought something had happened. Reverend Finch and myself and a few others, we went in to find you, and He paused, struggling to find words. We got lost. It was dark in there, darker than it should have been, and the house was bigger or we were smaller and time didn't work right. We wandered for what felt like days, maybe weeks, and then there was a light and we walked toward it, and here we are. Others were telling similar stories, fragments and variations on a theme, entering the house, becoming lost in its impossible interior, wandering through darkness or strange spaces that defied geometry, and then finally emerging here, now, in 1928. Some claimed they had been inside for minutes, others for years, but all agreed that the experience had been fundamentally dislocating, a journey through something that was not quite space and not quite time, but some combination of both. And still, the house was crumbling. Large sections of the wall were falling now, stones that had stood for centuries or longer, tumbling down to lie scattered in the grass. The roof collapsed inward with a sound like a sigh, and the door frame, with its carved symbols and warnings, split down the middle and fell in two separate pieces. Thomas stood and watched as the structure that had defined so much of his life destroyed itself before his eyes. He felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory or justice, only a strange hollowness, as if something fundamental had been removed from the world and the empty space it left was worse than the thing itself had been. When the last stone had fallen, when nothing remained but a tumbled ruin in the middle of the hollow, the shimmer in the air intensified for a moment and then vanished entirely, leaving behind only the cold January morning and nearly 100 people standing in confused silence, displaced in time, and trying to understand what had happened to them. In the days and weeks that followed, Timber Creek was overwhelmed by the sudden influx of temporal refugees. Families separated by decades were reunited, though the reunions were often painful. Children confronting parents who had not aged while they had grown old. Husbands and wives finding themselves suddenly separated by generations rather than just years. The town did what it could to help, and the state government eventually stepped in with resources and support. But the psychological and social impacts of what had happened would take years to fully process. Thomas helped where he could, sharing his own experience, offering what comfort and advice he had learned from his own decades of displacement. Samuel Kellogg and the Reverend Finch and others from the wagon train were given shelter and support, and slowly they began to adapt to the world they had been thrust into, a world of automobiles and airplanes and radio, where the frontier they had sought to settle was now long tamed, and the territories they had traveled through were states with cities and universities. Daniel Cartwright came to Timber Creek as soon as he heard the news. Now an old man himself, his theories vindicated and yet finding no satisfaction in being right. He examined the ruins of the house with instruments and careful observation, and his final report concluded that the structure had indeed been some kind of temporal mechanism, but that its purpose and origin would likely never be fully understood. The threshold he had warned about in his letter had been reached, and the result had been the release of everyone the house had trapped over its long existence, purchased at the cost of the structure's own dissolution. It fed on stolen time, Cartwright told Thomas, as they stood together in the hollow where the ruins lay scattered. And when it had accumulated enough, when it reached some critical mass, it spent itself all at once, returning what it had taken. Or perhaps it simply ran out of stability, the weight of all those years becoming too much to sustain. Either way, it's over now. The temporal anomaly is gone. This is just ground now, ordinary earth, no different from any other place. Thomas felt he should be relieved, but instead, he felt only tired. The exhaustion of a man who had spent most of his life carrying a weight that had suddenly been removed. What do we do with the ruins? Cartwright shrugged. Leave them, I suppose. They're evidence of something important, something that shouldn't be forgotten. Future generations might want to study them to understand what was here, or perhaps eventually they'll just weather away entirely and be forgotten, and that might be for the best. Sarah had come with Thomas to see the ruins, along with Jacob and Emma and Ruth, and they stood together as a family, looking at the tumbled stones that had so profoundly altered their lives. Sarah took Thomas's hand, her grip still strong despite the arthritis that plagued her fingers, and leaned against his shoulder. "Is it really over?" she asked quietly. "I think so," Thomas replied. "The house is gone. The danger is past. We can finally stop looking over our shoulders." But even as he said it, he wondered if it was true. The physical structure was destroyed, yes, but the scars it had left, the disruptions it had caused, would echo through generations. The children of those who had been displaced would grow up with the knowledge that time was not as stable as it seemed, that the past could reach forward and the future could reach back, and sometimes the two would meet in ways that destroyed lives. That knowledge, that fear, would be the house's true legacy, more lasting than any pile of stones. In the years that followed, as Thomas grew truly old and his body finally began to fail in the ways that all human bodies eventually do, he thought often about the house and what it had represented. Not just the physical danger, though that had been real and terrible, but the deeper implication. That time itself was not the fixed linear progression that people assumed, that there were places where the rules broke down, where the past and future could become tangled in knots that defied understanding. He wrote down his experiences in careful detail, filling notebooks with his memories and observations, hoping that future generations might learn from what had happened, might be more cautious about the boundaries between what was known and what was merely assumed to be impossible. Sarah helped him organize his notes, and Emma typed them up on the new typewriter the school had acquired, creating a document that was part memoir and part warning. On a warm evening in May of 1932, Thomas sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and red and purple. Sarah sat beside him, as she had for so many evenings, and they held hands in comfortable silence. Two people who had survived the impossible and built a life despite it. "Do you ever wish we could go back?" Sarah asked, breaking the quiet. "To 1853, to the life we were supposed to have?" Thomas considered the question carefully. It was not the first time it had been asked, though usually he was the one asking it of himself in the dark hours before dawn. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but then I think about Jacob and his family, about Emma's students, about Ruth and her husband, and the life they're building. None of that would exist if we had lived the life we planned. So perhaps the house didn't just take from us. Perhaps it also gave, in its own twisted way." Sarah nodded slowly. "I like to think we were meant to survive, that there was a reason we were the ones who came through with our family intact. So many others were broken by it, scattered across time and never reunited. But we held together. That has to mean something." "It means we were lucky," Thomas said, "or blessed, or simply stubborn enough not to give up. Maybe all three." They sat in silence for a while longer, watching the light fade from the sky and the first stars appear in the darkening blue. Somewhere in the town behind them, their grandchildren were playing, their laughter carrying on the evening air. Somewhere far away, the ruins of the stone house lay scattered in their hollow, slowly being reclaimed by the prairie grass and the patient earth. And somewhere in between, in the space where memory and moment intersected, Thomas and Sarah Weatherby existed, temporal refugees who had found their way home despite everything, who had survived the house that aged a century every time someone entered and lived to tell the tale. The wind that had carried the smell of broken earth and distant rain on that October day in 1853 still blew across the Kansas prairie, but now it carried also the smell of cultivated fields and distant cities, of a world that had moved on from the raw frontier and become something more complex and more dangerous and infinitely more connected. Time marched forward, as it always did, carrying with it the stories of those who had lived and those who had been lost and those who had somehow found a way to exist in the spaces between. And in the hollow northwest of Timber Creek, where the stone house had once stood, the grass grew tall and green, covering the ruins as if they had never been, as if the whole strange saga had been nothing more than a dream or a legend or a story told to frighten children into staying close to home. But the truth remained, buried in the earth and the memories of those who had survived, a warning that some frontiers were never meant to be crossed, some doors were never meant to be opened, and some houses held secrets that were better left undisturbed. Thomas Weatherby died in the autumn of 1935, surrounded by his family, his life having spanned 3 different centuries if you counted the stolen years, his mind clear until the end. His last words, a quiet instruction to Jacob to keep the notebook safe, to make sure the story was preserved. Sarah followed him 3 years later, her grief at his passing finally breaking the strength that had sustained her through so many hardships. They were buried side by side in the Timber Creek Cemetery, their headstones bearing dates that told only part of the story, that could not capture the strange journey they had taken through time and survival. Their children and grandchildren remained in Kansas, carrying forward the legacy of the house that had aged a century every time someone entered, a legacy of caution and resilience, and the knowledge that the world was far stranger and more dangerous than most people could imagine. The notebooks were donated to the State Historical Society, where they remain to this day, a primary source document of one of the most thoroughly documented temporal anomalies in American history. And sometimes, on the clearest days, when the light hits the prairie grass in just the right way, you can still see the hollow where the house once stood, a slight depression in the land where the vegetation grows differently, where the air sometimes seems to shimmer as if something is still there, still active, still hungry for the years of the unwary. But perhaps that's just the imagination, the human tendency to see patterns and meaning in the random chaos of existence. Or perhaps it's a genuine warning, a reminder that the veil between times is thinner than we like to believe, and that there are places in this world where the past and the future touch, and when they do, the consequences are measured not in moments, but in lifetimes.